How you doing? So my name is Jeff Fritz. I'm a program manager on the Microsoft .NET Developer Outreach team. There's 3 or 4 of us, and it's our job to make sure that you guys know what's coming down the pipe here with .NET, .NET Core, and all the stuff that we have planned here, because 2016 is a big year for .NET. We've made a ton of changes. We've been talking about these for a while. Some of them came in Visual Studio 2015 last year in July when we started to roll out these changes. We had betas that were included at that point, and we've been slowly making more and more changes to this, and we're getting very close to our final release here. And during our build conference back in April, end of March, beginning of April, we started to really land some of these topics. And I want to go over and make sure that you guys are comfortable with it, and then I'll show you some of the demos of the cool things that you can do now with Asp Net Core. All right? So, there's exciting times ahead. Huge things happening. We've got modern device experiences that are happening now with Universal Windows Platform, Xamarin, and now we've got cloud experiences that you're wired up and enabled for using .NET Core and Asp Net Core. We like to say that you can build for everything from 64K on a device on your Raspberry Pi, and it's not even 64K, right? It's like 64 meg, 640 meg, something like that on the latest Raspberry Pi, all the way up to 64 gig in the cloud, okay? One .NET, and it works across all of those devices. It's a lot to be able to see and work with and consume. So .NET today is getting bigger. There's a lot more to it, right? We've got the standard .NET framework that you've been using probably for the last 15 years. We released it in early 2000s, and it worked really well. Base class library for building things on your desktop, things for the web server. But we started enhancing and getting new things happening in our ecosystem. Xamarin came along, and now we can build for the Mac, for iOS, for Android, for your game systems. You can use Xamarin to program for your PlayStation, for your Wii, okay? Very cool stuff. And now we're introducing this thing that we're calling .NET Core, okay? So this is a complete cross-platform framework that Microsoft is writing that works natively on Mac, Linux, and Windows. Completely compatible and works across all of them. You're going to distribute these frameworks either when you install Windows with the .NET framework, you're going to package with your app in the Xamarin case, or with .NET Core, you can package and distribute that version of the framework with your application. So when you go to deploy your .NET Core application to a web server, you can actually have multiple versions of the framework laying around for your different applications. So your multi-host scenarios in Iis work very, very well. Then we're going to start to introduce new app models into this, right? We've got different application models that work with these different frameworks in different ways, right? The .NET framework is really good with WPF, Windows Forms, and ASP.NET. We call that the desktop framework, okay? Because it's the same framework whether you're on the desktop or the server. Xamarin, of course, works great with iOS, OS X, OS X, and Android, but this .NET Core piece here is going to work great with UWP, your Universal Windows Platform, and with Asp Net Core. Okay, so we've got 3 different flavors of the framework, 3 different flavors of base class libraries. Okay, anybody try and program back and forth between .NET Framework and Xamarin and try and share components, right, using things called portable class libraries? Nobody. Nobody's used portable class libraries in the room. I see one. One person. Okay, cool. So we've got this common infrastructure that we use across all of these, and that's what enables this portable class library concept that we currently have, where you can choose which frameworks and which application models you want to target, and we'll build your application appropriately so it works across those. Well, we're going to start to change things up, right? These app models are going to get a little bit simpler because these portable class libraries that we're building down here, we're going to start to take these implementations that you put down separately that reference your portable class libraries, and we're going to make it a little bit easier to work with. There's challenges out here, right? Developers, when you're working, trying to cross these boundaries, there's key APIs that are missing as you go from one to the next, okay? If you're trying to access Windows registry on the .NET framework, works great. But there is no Windows registry when you get to an iPhone, when you get to Linux or a Mac. So how do we do that? How do we handle that? Well, right now, it just errors out and says, not available, right? You'll get a compile time error, or it'll error out when it gets to that environment. So that's a lame experience. And then you need to master how these base class libraries work. And there's 3 of them right now. There's going to be more, right? If you're programming with Silverlight or some of the other models that are out there, you start to see a challenge. So where we're going to is we're going to rip out that middle set of base class libraries, and we're going to introduce something called the .NET Standard Library. Okay? This is one library to rule them all. That's a Lord of the Rings reference. I should have figured out a Captain America reference. So what this means is you're going to be able to reference a .NET standard, and it's just going to work across your targeted platforms. Because right now, when you start up and you say, I want to build a library that works for iOS and the web server, and you have to see a checkbox, and you choose those items, you now have no way to go back and say, oh, I want to add Android into the mix. You might break things, right? Or you want to add Xbox into it, and it'll invalidate some code, and now you're in a real challenge at that point. With the .NET Standard Library, you're going to be able to say, I'm choosing this level of compatibility, and everything will just work that's compatible with that. There are reference implementations that these frameworks implement, and then the native implementations, the full implementations that sit on top of those runtimes that will actually communicate to the operating system. You don't have to manage any of those. That's more or less how it works. So you're going to have the same APIs across all the platforms. No need to go and figure out how time zone works, how it's named one way over here on Windows, and it's differently over here on Linux. It's going to work in one way and just happen appropriately on both environments. We're going to simplify your surface area. All right? So in the future, as we start to build on and we say, hey, there's new features we want to do in our standard library, we're going to add these innovations up the side. They're going to be added on using our package manager, NuGet. You'll bring them in and add them into your application. So when you want to program to that IoT necklace, right? And there's some platform that supports necklace code, I don't know, right? Some sort of IoT jewelry. We can add those features on and implement a standard library version. This supports standard library 1.5, and it requires these extra features to support the IoT jewelry platform. You're going to be able to use both of our Visual Studio tools across all of these environments. You're going to be able to program for UWP, for iOS, Android, with Visual Studio Code and Visual Studio. You guys familiar with Visual Studio Code? Okay, I'm even getting applause down here, about half the room. So Visual Studio, of course, is our big enterprisey IDE, right? Integrated Development Environment experience that you can use to edit and write code, manage, debug, all that good stuff. We heard people say we'd like to have a similar editor experience on other platforms, right? On Mac, on Linux. So we extended the Electron editor and added on features that we wrote with TypeScript to create a full editor experience for .NET, C#, all that stuff. And that's what Visual Studio Code is. It is completely open source. You can go out to GitHub and download the source for Visual Studio Code and build it yourself if you don't trust us. It's all out there. Go ahead and download it and get your own copy. So, The .NET Standard Library, I've been mentioning this and saying, this is a great way to target things. There's 6 versions of .NET Standard, and it's because we need to bring all of these things together, bring them all into one house. So when you target .NET Standard 1, you're going to get .NET Core, .NET Framework from 4.5 and later, UWP, the Universal Windows Platform, Windows Store for Windows 8, Windows 8.1. You're going to get Windows Phone for Windows Phone 7, Windows Phone 8, Windows Phone 8.1. You're also going to get the Windows Phone Silverlight apps, Xamarin, and their Mono frameworks. Okay, so that's what you get when you target 1. And as we increase the version number, we're going to get more and more focused on a specific version. So as we go to 1.1, you're going to target and hit .NET Core, .NET 4.5, blah, 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 blah. Basically, we drop out the Silverlight capabilities when we get to 1.1. In 1.2, we crank up the version of the Windows Store. We're only going to target Windows Store 8.1. I left the WinPhone Silverlight in there. That shouldn't be in that tile. 1.3, we start to increase the version of the .NET framework we're supporting. .NET 4.6, and all of the phone and store application stuff drops out, and Xamarin is still in play at that point. When we get to 1.4, Mono drops out, and now we're getting more focused on .NET Core and .NET Framework, 4.6.1. And finally, 1.5, which is the one that we'd like you to target if you're using Asp Net Core, is just .NET Core and the .NET Framework 4.6.2, which is the latest version we announced at Build, and will RTM here in the next month or 2. Did I announce that? I didn't announce that. We're still working on it. I'm also the program manager for ASP.NET Web Forms, so we're working on it. So I mentioned that we do things open source now at Microsoft. There's a lot we're developing in the open, okay? The ASP.NET Core and .NET Core development process is completely in the open on GitHub, right? Marketing loves to show off these numbers. 175 Microsoft repositories out there, 24,000 forks. That's not somebody setting up for dinner, okay? These are people making copies of the source code so that they can go in and tinker with it and play with it. And folks say, hey, that's really great. Look at all these people making copies. But there are some other folks who are a little bit more pessimistic who say, look, all these people are making copies so that if you take it away, they've still got a copy of it. So that's what I'm excited about is the almost 4,300 contributors that we have to Microsoft .NET and ASP.NET projects. Okay, that's the community getting involved and making a real difference in where we take our platform for the next decade. We're not trying to set up and say, hey, here's what we're doing for 2017. Right? It's built, it's delivered here in 2016, it's good for 2017, and then we're taking it off the table. We know that we have 15 years of .NET history behind us, and we're trying to set up for the next 15 years, okay? That's something that's important to our customers. We know it's important to have a stable platform that doesn't significantly change over the long term. And that's why we're making this significant change now, is because things are modern. There's new things that have been brought into the mix, Xamarin, IoT, and the cloud, and we want to address them. On our web server right now in our internal performance lab, so this is the lab that the ASP.NET guys run. It's actually 2 desks that they put together, and they put their old desktops on it. They're getting 1.15 million requests a second. Now that's with the code that is currently committed to the repository. There's a pull request out there that adds another 500,000 on top of that, and we get to 1.6 million requests per second. We'll talk about performance in a little bit, but that's more than 6 times the performance of Node.js. Okay, that's pretty impressive. And more than 40%, it's actually more like 60% of the performance gains have come from folks in the community. Folks like you who have said, you know what, I know a good way to tune this. Let me try and submit something, and it just works. And we take it in, implement it, test it with all of our same rigor that all of our engineers' code goes through, and you know what? Merge it in and deploy. tremendous interaction. We really enjoy seeing this and working with you, the technical community. But when we have this open source integration and development process, it's interesting in good ways and bad ways. Anybody manage an open source project in here? One person? Really? Two. Okay, two. I'm happy I see two people. So, look, when you manage an open source project, everybody sees every line of code that you commit, especially if it's popular. And when you've got 4,300 people contributing, another 25,000 people that are watching because they forked your code, that's a lot of people that are watching the work that you're doing. So there's good, hey, look at all these people who are verifying all this great stuff that we're doing. And there's also bad. These people look in and see our code and they say, wow, you guys made a real mistake over here. It'd be great if you optimized this way. Or, why did you make this decision over here? We don't know why you're doing this. We'd rather you go and do things this way. Well, then we have to manage a message, right? Do we tell the community what we're doing before we commit the code? Or do we commit the code and then tell the community, okay, here's what we did? So it's a tricky message to manage. So we actually formed a foundation called the Dotnet Foundation that helps to guide open source projects through different steps of their evolution. Because there comes a point where you need to get legal involved around licensing to protect your project, around management of SSL certificates, keys, the secrets for where your website lives, passwords, all that stuff. So the Dotnet Foundation is all about really supporting the community. And my team owns and manages the foundation. We actually have somebody that isn't a Microsoft employee that manages it, but works with us. And it's a very important thing for us to help and foster the .NET ecosystem. And there are tons of really cool projects that are out there that have been committed to this ecosystem that you may use on an everyday basis that the foundation supports. And there's some big ones in here that were just recently added, like Mono. Xamarin donated the Mono source code to the .NET Foundation. So now you can install and use that without any concerns around licensing or whether it'll go away, because it's now fully supported by this body. Okay? There's also the Xamarin SDK. Everything you need to build and compile for iOS and Android is part of the foundation. Very, very cool stuff. So that's the .NET Foundation. Told you a lot about .NET Core. What do you say we get to Asp Net Core? So Asp Net Core is really, it's part of two versions of our ASP.NET web framework that we released in 2015. We released .NET Framework 4.6 and ASP.NET 4.6, which is a lot of what we were doing previously. It's an evolution of that, right? It's the next version, the stuff that you expect. Web Forms, MVC, Web API, SignalR. .NET Core was released as a beta. I think it was beta 6 that shipped with Visual Studio 2015 in July. And we've released updated versions for that. But .NET Core from Visual Studio, you can compile and run, like I was saying, Linux, Mac, and Windows. But you can choose to run .NET Core on ASP.NET Core. I'm sorry, you can choose to run ASP.NET Core 1 on either .NET Core or .NET Framework 4.6. You can choose how you want to run. Okay? Do you want the full .NET Framework, the desktop stuff that you've opted into and you've been using for the last 15 years? Or do you want to choose the new framework that's been built as an opt-in so that you can choose just those pieces you want and run on other frameworks? And then there's other cool things you can start to do. Are we good? We still? All right. I thought I lost the mic there. There's other cool things you can start to do with deploying to Docker containers. And then you start to see some really neat things with being able to build for resiliency and scalability at that point. But we have a common set of compilers and runtime components across them. You're going to use the same Roslyn compilers. You're going to use the same JIT. You're going to use the same programming languages. You don't have to choose those. It just works. So we had 7 key tenets that we targeted when we decided to do Asp Net Core. We wanted it to be totally modular. You choose the pieces you need, because right now when you use ASP.NET 4.6 and you start up a new web server with a new web application, you actually bring in Windows Forms. Does that make sense, to bring in this stuff to build a Windows desktop app when all you're doing is generating angle brackets and curly braces and shipping them over the wire? No. But the way that it was originally built, it was one base class library, and that made sense. So we wanted to make it modular. Toss out those parts that you don't need. We wanted to enable you to get to the cloud faster, right? We know that building things and having it run on your desktop or run on a server in your local data center is just the start. But when you need to scale, you're going to want to get into the cloud. Whether it's our cloud or somebody else's cloud, you want to get there at some point. We want to make that easy to do. I already spoke a bit about open source. We want to enable you to have a faster development cycle, right? Really, when you build a web forms app that was designed using that web forms framework that was designed in 2001, 2002, when you hit compile, you look at your watch, go get a cup of coffee, come back, and all of your projects are finally compiled and running. And that's a pain in the neck. We know you want to be able to make a change and see it immediately on a web page. And we've done that. We've enabled that type of interaction. We know you want to choose your editors, right? You don't necessarily want to use Visual Studio. Maybe you want to use Sublime. Maybe you want to use Emacs. So we're going to enable that too. And we've built tools to allow you to do that. I mentioned cross-platform and fast. And we'll talk about the performance numbers in about 2 or 3 slides here. So open source, can we see that? The screen's a little bit fuzzy. And I wanted to avoid navigating here because I know the web is going to be sketchy. This is github.com/ASP.NET. I took this screenshot this morning. The most recent repository the guys were working on is performance, and they made changes 8 hours ago. So while we were sleeping, they were working on performance. And hosting information, our Kestrel HTTP server, entity framework they were working on yesterday, it's all out there. It's all available for you to go take a look at and play with. Fork. Make some changes if you'd like. You can send them back to us and you might get it accepted and included in the source code. Performance matters. Now, we've built our own test center so that we can test ASP.NET Core and make sure that it does meet the performance goals that we have. Because when we first started testing performance with ASP.NET, we were getting 50,000 requests a second. That's terrible. So we built this test lab, and here's the machine definitions on the left. So we've got 2 web servers and then 2 load generators. And these are Xeon machines from a couple of years ago, but they've got a fair amount of RAM on them. In our last set of tests with the current code base, we went from 50,000 requests a second to 1.1 million requests a second on Windows, 928,000 requests a second, and Node.js has 173,000 requests per second. So we've improved significantly. And I mentioned there's a pull request waiting that puts another 500,000 on top of it. We've already tested the pull request, we just haven't merged it yet because we're actually trying to ship this thing, you know? There's other ones down here, Scala and Netty, they're a bit faster, but with that next pull request, we'll pass Scala, okay? Now, these are smaller machines than what the folks who write the Tech Empower benchmarks use. Who's familiar with Tech Empower? You guys heard of this? 1, 2, okay, not very many. So if you go to techempower.com, this is a group, it's a consulting firm that writes benchmarks. They test web frameworks. And yeah, you can't read that at all on this slide, I'm sorry. So they build these benchmarks. If you go there, you can take a look, you can browse through the benchmarks. We've actually done tests on the size machines that they have. So we went from the engineers' old desktops to Microsoft's big perf lab that's about the same size as this, maybe a little bit smaller. But these guys have Node at 315,000 requests per second. And the king of the hill right now, I can't even read it on that slide, is something called Rapidoid. Now, some of these folks, they've built these web frameworks. The second one is CPOLL CPPSP. Quite literally, they're using C++ to generate HTML. Does anybody want to use C++ to output HTML? I mean, it's kind of an educational thing. It's an experiment. They tried to see, hey, how does this work? But they're getting 7 million requests per second, right? That's the king of the hill. And Node, which is pretty well regarded as a very fast framework, is at 300,000. In our tests in this framework, we're at 3.6 million. That's before the next pull request, okay? So we're right in the top 10 at this point. It puts us still below Netty, but up there near the top. So fast. We're going to be there when we RTM this version, okay? You can use whatever you'd like. Atom, brackets, Sublime Text, Vim. Who likes VI? Emacs? Okay, so the VI people are over here and the Emacs are kind of over this way. Stay on that side of the aisle, all right? So, with some of our friends in the community, we built this project called Omni Sharp. Okay? When you're in Visual Studio and you do a control period and the IntelliSense dropdown appears, that's actually the compiler running in another thread, in some cases, in the latest cases, in another process, that's bringing back information about the current source code you're looking at and what code completion options are available. Omni Sharp takes that same concept and throws it out of process in a little tiny web server that's running in another process that these editors can connect to with a plugin so that you can get that same control dot experience. Very, very cool. There's easy instructions how to set that up if you go to omnisharp.net. And then you can start coding C#, VB, F# in your favorite editor. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
All right, sorry to interrupt, but we got an announcement that if you are parked at Bed Bath & Beyond or Roosters, you should move your car now because it may get towed. And we are encouraging you to tweet to @Cinemark if you have complaints about that. But they are going to be towing cars if you're parked over there. So thank you. What? The parking cop is gone? Okay. All right, thank you.
Must have my session here because you couldn't tell us 45 minutes ago? I'm rather disappointed in that. Okay. So, let's move on. So, Omni Sharp, that's how you can get .NET, IntelliSense, and there's actually some refactorings that come into these now with the Omni Sharp capabilities. And we'll find out if I have to go to the police station to get my car later. So, .NET Core. I talked about it briefly, and that it's the new framework we're bringing in. It's OSS, it's cross-platform .NET Standard and library. I introduced .NET Standard to you, and I told you the different flavors. You will only see that if you download the nightlies at this point. Okay? We're getting ready to roll this out. It will be coming very, very soon. There's now a .NET Core command line interface that you can use, right? You literally type the words .NET, and you can start to compile, restore packages, start up a new project, all from the command line. Because the command line really is universal across all three of these environments, Windows, Mac, and Linux. So it's important that we keep that compatibility. There's 3 different ways to deploy. App local, so package up your framework and ship it with your application. A shared framework, where you're going to install that framework somewhere locally on your machine and just reference it. Or Docker. Package up an entire container and ship it wherever you need to be. We see very high performance with this stuff, and we're getting native compilation into the mix in the future. So Asp Net Core builds on top of Dotnet Core. Single framework for web and microservices, right? Who's writing microservices? No, nobody. Okay, you're writing web applications? Yes, okay. That's okay. Some folks are very architecture enhanced, and they really like the whole microservices thing. So we start with this middleware pipeline, and I'm going to show you demos here in just a little bit where you build out in your pipeline, here's how I want the server to respond to different requests. Here's how I want the server to interact with my visitors. And we're going to fully integrate with that command line tooling. Everything actually runs from the command line, even when you're hosting inside of Iis. Right? That stuff was kind of hidden from you before with older versions of ASP.NET. It would just start up and run, and you were in Iis with a little web config file, and you knew nothing the better. We're actually going to be running behind the scenes on the command line. So you're going to see the performance just take off. The key thing we like to talk about the performance is that a number of the folks that work for us built the content management system called Orchard, right? You guys heard of Orchard? Okay, I see some people. So Orchard is a content management system. A lot of folks at Microsoft built it. There's some folks in the community that worked on it as well. It was originally written in ASP.NET MVC and used a lot of things around HTTP modules and handlers, so that you get that software as a service, multi-tenant approach. So you could have different tenants that host different versions of content, right? Different silos. And the folks who are working on this, some of them are on the Asp Net Core team. They migrated their code so it runs on the latest version of Asp Net Core, and they saw a 10 times speed improvement. All right? So with all the stuff that we eliminated, you have to opt into now. That's not insignificant to get that kind of upgrade. So let me go over to the code, and I just want to walk through a couple of quick samples, show you the .NET command line experience, and then I'm going to open up for a little bit of question and answer so that we can answer your questions about where this is going. All right? And hopefully the answer isn't with our cars in the parking lot, as the rest of the folks are trying to find out. So let's come on now. All right. So this is Visual Studio Community Edition 2015. I've actually already installed I've got a nightly build of RC2 is the current version that we're working on. There's an RC1 version of Asp Net Core that was released in November. It is very feature complete. You can use it and debug inside of Visual Studio, and we will support you with that. You do have a Go Live license. When the RC2 comes out, you'll need to migrate to the RC2, and we're going to expire that Go Live license, as we do with all of our preview releases. So if I come in and using this version of Visual Studio and the .NET framework, you're not seeing anything. I thought I went and said duplicate. Thank you for the background. Can we see it now? Good. So when I say File New Project, I now have a couple different choices in this window besides just ASP.NET Web Application. I can choose ASP.NET Core Web Application, ASP.NET Core Web Application on .NET Framework. If I extend this over, you'll see. I also have a .NET Core choice over here on the side, and I can choose to build a class library for .NET Core, a console application, or even an ASP.NET Core web application, the same thing that I had up here under web. So let me start with an ASP.NET Core application. And now I get that same one ASP.NET dialog box. And instead of having a bunch of different choices with MVC and web forms and web API, everything is MVC in this model. So we've got 3 different choices: empty, web API, and web application. Gets right to it. So I'm going to say no authentication and just open the empty. So you can really see that when we say we're building an empty application, there is quite literally nothing in this. So it's going to restore my packages. Fortunately, I have them all cached locally. So there is nothing going on in here. It's very much like a Node app where all we're doing is saying response right, hello world. We're answering every request with hello world. I'm going to launch that. It is hot up here. Yeah, that's right. I just changed teams. So this is not fully optimized, of course, because it is nightly. I'm showing you guys the latest and greatest. And maybe it's misbehaving because the demo gods love me so much. Come on now. When we configure these applications, I'll just get in and start talking about this while it's still shuffling around here. Instead of having a CS project file, something that's managed by MS Build, those great big XML files, we now have this project JSON file that specifies all of my dependencies in here in a human readable format that you can come through and edit. So I have these 2 references to my server, Iis Integration and Kestrel. Kestrel is my ASP.NET web server that we're building. That plugs in just like the old W3WC exe runtime, service ran inside of Iis when you would run the older version of ASP.NET. So this is how we integrate and use our new web server with Iis. These are actually references to NuGet packages. Oh good, we're going to start now. So we're delivering all the different versions that you need for whatever environment inside of a package so that we can uncork that and use it appropriately. So of course, now after all that, I finally get hello world. But if I come through and I add inside my startup, if I throw a new exception, this is an error. Is this going to take this long for every time? Because that is not going to fly. No. Let's see what we can do to speed this up. What else we got hanging around here? You'll notice I've got 3 different versions of Visual Studio running. That's how you can tell either I'm a consultant or I actually work on building this product. No, I'm not going to get any improvement on this thing. And that's going to make these demos really, really slow. What this is going to show you is that the errors are actually handled by ASP.NET when it loads up by just throwing an empty page. It doesn't actually return anything because typically when you're in a production environment, you don't want your visitors to see your errors that you're throwing. All right, that's kind of a no-no. So by default, we're not enabling that old white screen of doom with all the information. And I am not getting any help here, am I? Yeah, I tried to stop that. This is what I get for using beta code. Like I said, we're still working on it. There we go. Let me restart. So, Community Edition. This is the free edition that you can download at any time as a hobbyist, as someone who's working at home. You can always download and use this version. All of the tools to use ASP.NET, Universal Windows Platform, Xamarin, so you can build for iOS and Android, they all work and come in this version of Visual Studio. So for you as a hobbyist, for a small business, there's limitations. It's so many users in your business. It's like 25, 50 users can use this version of Visual Studio, and there's also a revenue number that you must be under in order for this to be available. Education, schools can use this version, and of course nonprofits can use this without any kind of licensing question. So let me try that, recompile again, and see if it's going to go just as long as I thought before. Man, that's really annoying. Come on now. So where I'm going with this is you actually need to add in, as a feature, the ability to throw diagnostic information and error pages. So you add in diagnostic information by referencing Microsoft dot, where is it? ASP.NET. I'm sorry, ASP.NET Core now. Diagnostics. And then I bring in that version. And you can see it's going to restore that package because I edited this. And I can start to add into my application the ability to put up an exception page. Because I'm a developer, because I'm running as a developer locally, I want to put up an exception page that gives me information about what error was run, and I don't want that to appear when I get into production. And it's still trying to build. No. So this is what I'm talking about, how we have to start to layer things in. And by default, we actually don't serve static content. So HTML, CSS, JavaScript, images, those don't get served by default. Why? Because you don't accidentally want something served that you don't mean to, right? That could be a security issue. So we actually move all of our static content under this www root folder, and anything that's under there is eligible to be served statically, right? The service isn't going to get involved and try and interpret anything. So if I come in and I just add a new item, and let's add an HTML page, and we will call this index.html. Hello, Star Trek. Right, I need to start adding that capability into the mix. So that's actually another package, Microsoft ASP.NET Core, and this is the same type of thing you would do in Node. You actually have to tell it to serve these things. Static files, and then I've got a version already available here locally. Save that, and it's going to go and restore my packages. And over here, I can now say app.useStaticFiles, and it will serve those capabilities. Finally came back to me. So, this is what I'm talking about, how you have to opt in. It's modular, and you have to build out the features you need. Now, I've only added 3 or 4 packages here just to get to this point. Let me show you the full template for an application. So web application 27. Let me do the full. So now, when I look at that project JSON, by default, I get a lot more in the box. I get diagnostics capabilities. I get identity information because I opted in to get security. MVC, because I want to use the MVC framework to build user interfaces. Tag helpers, our new way that you can write and manage code inside of MVC in an abstract fashion. Entity framework, and then information to manage configuration and logging. These all come by default in the new templates. Now, for those of you that have been around and have tinkered with this section here, this is the way that we're going to allow you to lie. So by default, I said that we use a .NET Core version, and we're saying that we are using, where is it? .NET Core version 1.0. But we're going to lie, and we're going to tell ASP.NET, you know what? If you find libraries out there that implement any of these frameworks, the .NET 5.6 specification, which was something that our Universal Windows platform was tinkering with, different ways to reference .NET and versions. The old DNX Core 50, which was a beta reference to the .NET Core framework, or to the portable framework that supports .NET 4.5 and Windows 8. Go ahead and try and use those packages inside of this application. So it's kind of a escape hatch that you can use to use other libraries, like JSON.NET actually adheres to one of these and will work now inside this project system. So, real basic stuff. When I try and run this now, let's see if this one goes. Yeah, this one works fine. The really simple one takes forever. This one, no problem. The really complex one, go figure. And my Iis hasn't started up yet. So some of these other things that you see inside this project JSON file, there's content specified here. These are things that we're not going to compile. We're not going to publish anything in the node modules folder. So folks have been asking Microsoft for a while, hey, when are you going to write a JavaScript framework that does X? Well, you know what? There's so many folks out there that have written really cool JavaScript frameworks. We're just going to enable you to use those. Why reinvent the wheel when you already like Knockout, Backbone, React, Angular, right? We're going to let you bring those in with the tools that folks already know and love. So that's why there's actually a package JSON. It's hiding here on me. There's a package JSON file that specifies a couple things to bring in. And in this case, by default, we bring in gulp, right? Gulp is a task runner you can use to compile your client-side resources and make them available a little bit easier. So we also support gulp. And you can build out your tasks appropriately with great syntax highlighting inside Visual Studio. But you might be familiar and very comfortable with using the command line to go and run these tools, and that's great. Look at this, finally going to get this launched. That's great, and I can't get into the UI now. So the application ran, and it's got that same standard user interface that we kind of know and expect from previous versions of Visual Studio and ASP.NET. What I want to show you is you can run everything inside your gulp file visually from within Visual Studio right here. And you can bind these different tasks to different events inside your project. So when I run a clean on my project, run my gulp clean process. Now, interesting story. JavaScript frameworks and tools evolve really fast. Visual Studio, not so much. So how do we keep up? Well, the Task Runner Explorer is actually an extension. So in the time from when we started building the Task Runner Explorer to now, we've had 4 different frameworks come and go as the preferred framework that folks want to use inside of Visual Studio to automate their JavaScript. So what do? Right? There's folks that want to use Bower to go and download stuff. So we actually have Bower JSON that we've enabled here, so you can bring Bower in. But now people are saying, oh, Bower is not being maintained. We'd rather use NPM, the Node Package Manager, to go get our resources and bring them in. Well, I don't have the ability from my from my Task Runner Explorer to run NPM. So what we did was we wrote a plugin for the extension so that you can call NPM tasks. So if I go up here to Tools, Extensions and Updates, and if I look at my installed list here, there is an NPM task runner. So if you add scripts to your NPM element, to your NPM package JSON file, you will start to get there we go. Right, if we call this build, and let's say something happens there. If I go over to Task Runner Explorer, come on now. I've got 2 extra things here. Why isn't it seeing my build script? All right, so I've seen people use this type of approach. There it is. So now I can run tasks from inside NPM right here in the Task Runner Explorer. And when you run these, right, I'll just run the gulp clean task. It's all the same thing. You see effectively what happens on your console right there inside of the window of Visual Studio. So that's kind of cool, but Jeff, you told me that we don't need to use Visual Studio to do all of these things. So I'm actually going to leave Visual Studio for a little bit. And I'm going to run down to the command line, because that's where all cool programmers work these days. At least that's what I'm told. I'm going to go into my dev folder, and I want to tell you about Yeoman. Right? So Yeoman is a tool that folks in the Node community use to generate some code for their application. We've written a generator called Asp Net. And when I first saw the syntax for this, Yo Asp Net, I thought, hey, I'm a Philly guy, that's great. But no, it's not the same Yo. When I run this, it's going to come up and I'm going to get cool ASCII art, because all modern tools have ASCII art. There's a common theme there, you'll see. And I can choose what template project I want to build. And these are very much the same templates that I saw in Visual Studio. So, funny story. It says use the arrow keys to navigate this, and that doesn't work because Node doesn't like to support the arrow keys in Windows. Okay? So you can actually access these things by counting down and hit the number of the corresponding item, and it's 1 indexed instead of 0 indexed. So I want web application basic, that's 4. All right, cool. And let's call this Stir Trek Demo. And it just went and generated all my files for me. Now, this is using the current version. This template is using the current version that's out, the RC1 version, a previous version. So I've got it from the RC2 nightly that I have installed. So I've got 2 different versions installed. I'm going to run DNU restore, which is going to go grab my NuGet packages and wire it up to this project. That's done. I can build my application, and I bet you this runs a lot faster than it did for Visual Studio. Maybe. And I can actually take a look at the website. So this is running with the Kestrel web server locally right here on the command line, and I can go to localhost 5000, and there it is, Star Trek demo, and I've got the exact same template. So I've generated code using Yeoman. I've built it using the command line, and I've got a website that looks and runs pretty good. I can use all my other tools right here on the command line like I would, and I get a cool log of everything that's happening right here. So what I like to do is actually run this side by side with something that's monitoring and rerunning all my gulp tasks against my CSS and JavaScript files, maybe less files, so that I've got statuses coming down as I'm making changes to my code. So that's pretty cool. Let me stop that. And now let me launch Visual Studio Code. So this is our open source free editor that works on every environment. And my debugger, there's a debugger that's enabled for the RC2. Doesn't quite work in my environment right now, especially because this project is running RC1, the current version. So inside of here, it looks very similar to any other Electron editor, but I've got this file list down the side, and I can go in and I can start working with views and controllers like I would in a normal MVC project. Right? I can change these things. Come on now. Oh, right off the side. Hello, stir track. Right, and recompile. Great. That's refreshing. Go to my About page. Hello, stir track. Okay, fine. There's a tool that's being deployed with the next version that will allow you to watch for changes. But I'm old school. I like to use NodeMon. Right? Let me clear screen. That's really low at the bottom. I like to use NodeMon. So if I use NodeMon exec dnx web, and if I pass in, I think it's -e, monitor my CS and JSON files. So now this is going to monitor and rerun dnx web anytime there's a change. So I've got this over here. I'll put that over there. Go team cap. And now I can go back and forth because I'm refreshing automatically. Visual Studio will do the same thing if you don't have the debugger attached. Full Visual Studio, okay? So that's a trick that I like to use to make sure that it works back and forth for me. So, okay, I've got another editor here, and I want you to notice this little flame down here. This is the Omni Sharp logo that shows that it's detected the project, and it's got all of its IntelliSense capabilities loaded for this. So even though I'm in a text editor that isn't Visual Studio, I can still get IntelliSense about everything for this controller or these objects, right? It's all available to me. So that's nice, but what about some of those deployment things, right? Docker is a big thing. Who's using containers? Not many people, okay? 5% maybe? So the interesting thing about containers is that you can compile up your application and ship it as a whole operating system image that can run on another environment, and you don't have to worry about building an MSI or building a publish script and configuring a web server, because you've actually built all that into your Docker image. So I put together a little image. Come on, Docker. And I have Docker running here on my Windows 10 machine. This is what I get for not restarting my machine before the demo. There we go. Once again, you know it's modern because there's ASCII art. I can't make this up. So, there we go. So, let me go over to that demo. That's in, it is under Star Trek Docker. See, now I can do LS and I feel all at home. So this is just a little application where I'm capturing the information about the server, and I'm going to put it right on my index page. Right here. Hello from server, and then the host name. Okay? Go away. There it is. All right. So if I were to run this now, right? So it says hello from server JE Fritz SP3. That's the name of this machine. That's nice. But I've actually built this into a Docker container image, and I've got a Docker file that comes by default with these templates. So it builds out and restores and sets up port 80 for my application. If I run that, so I'm going to say docker run -d disconnected. I'm going to name this web. I need to open up the port, pass it through the firewall to my machine so I can actually connect to it and see it. And I believe I called this StirTrek Web. Nope, that's not it. What did I name that image? I called it, yeah, StirTrek Web. What am I missing here? Docker run -d. Oh, it should be --name. There it goes. So you saw how fast that responded. If I browse to it, so now this is coming out of a Docker container that's hosting a Linux image that I've layered my ASP.NET application on top of, and it's got this SHA. You can see it's the same SHA that's reported over here, is the name of that service. 6baker05, 6baker05. Okay? So I've built an image, it's sitting here on my machine, I can deploy it out to a repository, and in production I can pull down that same image and run it, and it has the exact same contents that I built and ran here locally. Right? That's the benefit of using Docker. Right? You no longer have that it works on my machine syndrome, because your machine, you're actually lifting up and publishing to production. All right? But this is nice, and it's really great that I can actually publish multiple versions of these side by side. So I can start Web 2 on port 81, done, that's up and running. And if I navigate to port 81, instead of getting 6baker05, I got 0baker dog 3. Right? It's a different machine. I've got two of these sitting there side by side. So now when I want to scale, I can do so very quickly. It was split second and my next web server was running. If you're in Azure or in any other cloud and you need to start up a virtual machine or a new web service and launch another instance of your web application, it takes what? 5-10 minutes? Because it allocates another host, starts deploying your code, and it's a mess. It takes a long time. Here we've got split-second uptime, split-second start time when we start to introduce other containers. But I don't want to run this in this manner every time there's another one. Let me remove these two. So that one's down, and that one's down. I can use something called Docker Compose, where Docker Compose allows me to say, you know what, here's how my web application works. I've got two different services. I'm going to start my StirTrek web image. That's my web image for my application. And then I can start, in this case, a load balancer. I'm going to use the HA proxy Linux service. I'm going to link it to any web image that I've built, map my sockets so that I can see these things. And I'm going to listen on port 80. I'm also going to listen on 1936. So 1936 is the HA proxy stats port. So by introducing this, I can now start up a collection of containers at the same time. So if I do Docker Compose, and I say up, that's not what I wanted to do. Docker Compose up -d. It's actually starting a bunch of them for me. Check this out. Come on now. Where did we go? Go away. Stop and remove all those. See, I already showed the end thing here. Oh my gosh, before I even got it running. Try that again. Docker compose up. Nope, it's running all of them for me. And it's all listening out there. And there they go. If I take a look at those stats, there we go. So this is coming from the load balancer that I've started. So I've got 5 web servers. If I go to port 80, they should actually come back. There it goes. So I've got 5 of these things sitting out here that it's just bouncing around. So now I can test what it's like to have multiple web servers behind a load balancer on my desktop machine as I'm building my application. So now that's great, and there's other ways to instrument this, but I can also test and scale things very, very quickly. So that's starting up, 5 instances? I can say Docker compose, scale, web equals, I only need 2. It's going to remove the extra ones. And I'm still out here running. All right? Come on now. There it is. So it gives me a way to test, gives me a way to deploy, and get the same experience everywhere. Now, we ran a demo at Build, and because of the lack of network here, I didn't want to tempt the fates here, where we were able to deploy Docker images because all kinds of hosts support this, to Amazon's EC2, to the Azure cloud. We even got it into Kubernetes, but we had a little bit of a problem getting that wired up at the last minute. But you can then instrument across all of those services if you need real scalability and uptime, and load balance between various containers at each one of those clouds. So now you've taken something you've built here locally, put it into a container, and deploy it all over the world very, very easily when you look at that. There's video of that up on Channel 9 if you really want to see this demo we built. Let me go back to the slides and wrap up here, because I want to make sure you get some information. There we go. So we like to say it's a great time to be a .NET developer because you can build anything with .NET right now. Windows, server applications, device applications, IoT applications. You can do all of that right now. Get ASP.NET right now at get.asp.net. Gee, go figure, that's nice and easy. Learn about everything that we're building at docs.asp.net. It's actually an open source repository of documents that we're building out. There's pull requests that you can submit for anything that you see wrong or that you feel could be updated to explain things better. You can get involved. And our team will review any submission and make sure that it meets our standard criteria to be published. It's open source. There's the location of the GitHub repository for ASP.NET. We have a weekly stand-up. Microsoft is an agile organization, so we have a stand-up with you, the community, because you're our biggest stakeholder. If you go to liveasp.net on Tuesdays, there's a video stand-up. It's a Google Hangout, actually, that you can watch and participate in. I really encourage you to check it out this week because we're getting very close to the release, and they have some announcements they want to discuss this week on the meeting. Our blog, where we're going to post any announcements about this, is blogs.msdn.com/webdev. If you want to reach out to me and have any questions you want to talk about, go to twitter.com/C#Fritz. My blog is jeffreyfritz.com. I've actually started a series there where I'm giving little 10-minute tips about Asp Net Core. I'm posting them to YouTube. You can go and watch, and in 10 minutes, while you're having a coffee, you can learn a little bit something more about ASP.NET. And I've also got courses that we're posting on wintellectnow.com. If you use the code FRITZ2016, you'll get, it's like 8 hours for free. And each video is an hour long, so you got plenty of time to learn all about great stuff out there about ASP.NET, about DevOps, lots of really neat stuff. That's all I've got. We've got, I think we're just over? So Thank you very much for coming out here. It's early in the morning, and we've got a bunch of hours till that movie. I really appreciate you guys coming.